21 years old, I went backpacking through Europe with a couple of girlfriends, and nothing extraordinary. We brought a backpack each and rolls of film. Some of you here, a few of you might remember traveling with actual rolls of film. So our intent was to pretty much follow the typical 20-something backpacker route, visiting bustling hostels, beer gardens, breweries, popular night spots, and even coffee shops. But in many ways, our trip was a bit atypical because I had my own itinerary. So long before our trip, I had brought along a book, a travel guide to Jewish Europe, which I had obsessively tabbed with a complex color-coded tabbing system that categorized places by topic and by country. I added highlights to place names and addresses and copious notations in the margins. And though considered sacrilegious by many, I do write in my books. And I even completed some, actually quite a bit of the supplemental reading materials. So unbeknownst to my traveling companions, no matter how late our nights were, I had an itinerary to follow the next day. Well, actually, we all did, because I dragged them around with me everywhere, rattling off history and facts. We saw deserted former Jewish quarters, cemeteries, concentration camps, restaurants, homes, synagogues. So what I didn't know at the time was I was actually engaging in cultural heritage tourism. And I might have been more of a, Europe on a $10 a day, shoestring budget traveler. But collectively today, this is big business. And cultural heritage tourism is simply traveling to places that authentically represent the past. And today, this is actually very, very big business. And while it's clear that tourism in general provides jobs, business opportunities, strengthens local economies, when coupled with cultural heritage sites, the impact is all the greater. So when I moved to Hong Kong in 2002, I sort of moved off the map and off the radar of the typical Jewish tour path. But my move opened up the possibility of exploring an entirely new set of Jewish narratives. In the typical Judaic Studies course in the United States, the Jews of the Far East are barely even a footnote. And this isn't surprising, though, given the scintilla of information we were taught about the East in general in the U.S. In a standard U.S. survey course of Jewish civilization in the 1990s, there's barely a mention of the Jews of India. And Jews of India have had a rich and vibrant history on the subcontinent spanning over 2,000 years. And actually, it wasn't until the 24/11 attack on Mumbai in 2008 when people really began to say and ask the question, are there really Jews in India? Who are they? And what do they look like? And these communities are rapidly dwindling today with only approximately 5,000 Jews remaining in India. And that's less than 1/10 of the population of only 60 years ago. And as for China, with the current shift in geopolitics, there are contemporary Jewish communities cropping up throughout the country. Jews have actually found refuge in China as early as the 9th century. And as quickly, though, as these waves of immigration began, they ended. And the Jews of China's past are no more. So to quote from a 1963 editorial from the New York Times on the destruction of Penn Station, we'll probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. In preparing for this talk, I spoke with actually my son, Ian, who's a typical 11-year-old. And he was not impressed that I was giving a TEDx talk, and generally has seemingly little to no interest in the articles I write on cultural heritage. But yet he and his siblings have been dragged from place to place on my cultural heritage trips. And I do make him do a bit of supplemental reading. But while poring over old photographs, I asked him what he thought the importance of seeing these sites were. And he responded, so we don't make mistakes again like World War II. The old buildings are a reminder, and they show us what living conditions were like then. And he identified the former Jewish ghetto in Shanghai is the most important place he has seen in Asia. So, even through those thick skull candy headphones, apparently he has been listening to me, and I'm just hoping that maybe the urban planning authorities in Shanghai are too. So Shanghai is undergoing a massive transformation today, and on the slate is the renovation of the entire Hangzhou ghetto area. This is there. And at the heart of the Hangzhou ghetto area is the Ohel Moshe synagogue. Now, Jews settled in Shanghai as early as 1900 in great numbers. But their numbers swelled literally overnight when during World War II, over 20,000 Jewish refugees flooded in to Shanghai, escaping Nazi-occupied Europe. Now, ultimately, many of these refugees were forced by the Japanese to live in one extremely overcrowded area with deplorable living conditions known as the Hankyu Ghetto. Now, again, this is the Ohel Moshe Synagogue, which lies at the heart of the ghetto area, and it's been beautifully restored on the outside. And the inside, interestingly, has been transformed into the Jewish Refugees Museum. And this is a government-run attraction in Shanghai, despite the fact that Judaism isn't even a recognized religion in China. This is another shot of the ghetto area. Now, a second synagogue also stands in Shanghai, and that's called Ohel Rachel. Now, Ohel Rachel's renovation was first publicly debated in 1998 in response to a planned visit to the site by Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright. Now, ultimately, the renovation was completed in 2010 for the Shanghai Expo, and Ohel Rachel then was temporarily open to tourism. So there's an ongoing battle to permanently open Ohel Rachel to tourists, and ultimately, again, tourism can play a powerful role in the battle of use over that synagogue. And I think that the example of Hankyu is the government understands the cultural heritage value of these sites and the potential for it to draw in visitors. So next on our whirlwind tour of Jewish China, going to take you to Kaifeng. Now, Kaifeng is probably the most extreme example of cultural heritage tourism that I can think of. I recently had the pleasure of meeting a young woman from Kaifeng, Jin. And Jin is one of the approximately 1,000 Chinese recognized as descendants of the ancient Jewish community of Kaifeng. And she actually now lives in Israel, and she's the first Chinese-born Israeli tour guide living in Israel and sharing her home with Chinese tourists. And now Jin's story and the story of the other Kaifeng Jews truly is remarkable, because in this story, cultural heritage tourists had a leading role in the preservation of not monuments and structures, as in Shanghai, but entirely of memory or intangible heritage. And Jews, Silk Road traders, began to arrive in Kaifeng as early as the 9th century. And they were welcomed by the emperor, and they lived comfortably for centuries there. And while they certainly assimilated, they also, though, held on to many ancient traditions. Eventually, though, a series of floods and other natural disasters ate away at their synagogue or spiritual home, and it was completely destroyed by about the mid-1800s. And the last rabbi died in that same century. Eventually, the community was forced to sell off each remaining artifact bit by bit, piece by piece, until nothing but memory and narrative remained. When China began to open up to the West, and likewise the West to the possibility of exploring China, academics began to study the history of this unique minority community. And a group of actually American Jewish tourists in the 1990s stumbled upon this tiny footnote and decided to make their way to Kaifeng. And while they were centuries too late to really see the Jewish sites of Kaifeng, except for a marker that memorializes where the great synagogue once stood, and a street sign for teaching the Torah lane, which is just a tiny reminder of the depth of commitment of this community. What they did find was the imprint that the Jews of Kaifeng had left on their descendants, and memory and narrative had survived flood, war, and assimilation. So pretty quickly after that first trip, Kaifeng became sort of the hot spot for the more intrepid Jewish cultural heritage tourists. And with them, these tourists brought books for learning, ritual objects, and their own traditions. And entirely new learning institutions funded by that tourism began to crop up in Kaifeng. And an entire revival of Jewish life was sparked for many of the descendants of that ancient community. And so tourists still continuously go there and continuously foster the increased growth of these learning institutions. And ultimately, for the Kaifeng community, memory and narrative were far more and far greater and more powerful tools than an engraved plaque attesting to sort of a near-forgotten history. We're going to look at the city of Harbin. Now, Harbin is probably best known for tourism for its famous ice festival. Personally, though, a bit put off by the minus 50-degree temperatures of Harbin's Siberian-like winters, I will likely never make it there to see the ice festival in person. I was, however, there in October to get a look at the Jewish cultural heritage of the city. And Harbin was actually once home to a thriving community of Russian Jews who began to arrive in Harbin in the late 1800s. And they came to Harbin to escape poverty and persecution that they were suffering in Russia. And Harbin opened up new opportunities for them. At its height in about the 1920s, the population of the Jewish community of Harbin reached over 20,000. In 1949, however, Harbin became part of the People's Republic of China. And by 1955, under 3 Jews from this community of 20,000 remained. The community continued to dwindle until the last 3 Jews actually left Harbin in the early 1980s. So Harbin now, without Jews, interestingly, the Jewish cultural heritage of the city is now being preserved by the local government. And I recently had a debate with a friend and actually an expert on the Jewish history of Harbin. And he was adamant that the local government didn't actually care about the Jewish cultural heritage of their city, and that their primary motivator was money from tourism, that they spoke in only dollars and cents. And you know, at the end of the day, their sentimentality or lack thereof is actually entirely irrelevant because the effect is the same. There are informative plaques on former Jewish homes, synagogues, schools, the soup kitchen, the cemetery, banks, and other institutions. And these signs are in Chinese, in English, and in Hebrew. And once again, even though Judaism is not a recognized religion in China, the former so-called the new synagogue of Harbin has been beautifully preserved on the outside, and the inside is now a museum on the Jewish history of Harbin. And this is no small statement as to the government's commitment to the preservation of their Jewish heritage, no matter what their motivation is. Also, quite similarly, the Jewish cemetery, though not in its original location, boasts over 400 identifiable Jewish graves, over 600 Jewish graves in total, making it the largest Jewish cemetery actually in the whole region. So, you know, what is the point of this between these 3 examples of Kaifeng, Harbin, and Shanghai? You know, at the end of the day, while some people might sort of fight madly to save a site by staging wild protests, throwing themselves in front of bulldozers, we as tourists can play our own role by really just visiting these sites and sending the message that, you know, this matters to us. And cultural heritage tourism really is a powerful tool to help bring about preservation. And, you know, in these cases and in many other cases, it's of vital importance in communities that are dwindling or have altogether died. And an entire people's history should never be reduced to a mere footnote or notation scribbled in a margin. How we work to preserve history, tangible history and intangible history, monuments and memory, is really the true determinant of our future. And also really what better way for us to justify a trip. So, thank you.